Jonathan Smith had always considered himself a fair person. He prided himself on treating everyone equally, no matter their background. His small electronics repair shop in a quiet town had been his livelihood for years, and he had built a reputation for being reliable and honest. Every morning before opening his shop, Jonathan followed the same routine. He walked to the little cafe down the street, ordered a black coffee, and spent a few minutes waking up before tackling the day's work. It was a simple pleasure, a small moment of peace before the busyness of his job took over. This particular morning started out no differently. He stepped into the cafe, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and pastries filling the air. He nodded to the barista, placed his order, and glanced around the room while waiting. That's when he noticed Michael Johnson, sitting alone at a corner table. Michael was a construction worker, a strong-built black man who had lived in the town as long as Jonathan could remember. They weren't close, but they had known each other since high school. Occasionally, they exchanged small talk whenever they ran into each other, mostly about sports or work. Feeling friendly, Jonathan grabbed his coffee and walked over. "Hey, Michael, mind if I join you?" Michael looked up, hesitated for a second, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sure, man." Jonathan sat down, stirring his coffee as Michael took a sip of his own drink. "How's work?" Jonathan asked. Michael shrugged. "Busy. We're working on that new housing project near Main Street. Long hours, but good pay." "That's great. Business is steady for me, too. Just fixed a kid's laptop yesterday. Turns out he'd spilled soda all over it and thought it would magically fix itself overnight." Michael chuckled. "Yeah, people expect miracles sometimes." Their conversation flowed easily for a while, touching on town gossip, work, and eventually sports. That's when the shift happened. Michael mentioned his favorite basketball team and how he thought they were going to dominate the season. Jonathan, being a diehard fan of a rival team, couldn't resist countering his argument. "No way, man. Your team's been trash for years," Jonathan teased. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Trash? You're kidding, right? We made it to the playoffs last season. Meanwhile, your guys were sitting at home watching." Jonathan smirked. "That was luck. You know they're overrated." Michael leaned forward slightly. "Overrated? You sound like those sports analysts who talk out of their asses. We've got talent, and you know it." The banter escalated. What had started as playful teasing turned into something more intense. Their voices grew louder, their words sharper. "You just don't get it," Michael said, shaking his head. Jonathan scoffed. "Maybe you just don't want to admit when you're wrong." By now, other customers had taken notice. The cafe owner, an older man named Greg, walked over. "Hey guys, let's keep it down, all right?" Michael exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, we're good." Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling a slight tension in the air. He was about to say something to ease the mood when the cafe door opened, and a police officer stepped inside. Officer Reynolds was a tall, broad-shouldered white man in his mid-40s. His eyes immediately scanned the room, settling on Jonathan and Michael. "We got a call about a disturbance," Reynolds said, his voice firm. Jonathan frowned. "That's ridiculous. We were just talking." Reynolds ignored him and turned to Michael. "Sir, I need you to step outside with me." Michael blinked in disbelief. "What? Why me? We were both here." Reynolds' expression didn't change. "Step outside." Jonathan felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. He glanced around and noticed that some of the customers were whispering, watching intently. "Officer, this isn't necessary," Jonathan said. "It was just a stupid argument about basketball." Reynolds gave Jonathan a quick look before focusing back on Michael. "Sir, are you refusing to comply?" Michael exhaled slowly and stood up, his jaw tight. "I'm not refusing anything," he said, his voice measured. He followed the officer outside. Jonathan hesitated, then got up and moved to the window, watching as Reynolds spoke to Michael. It wasn't clear what was being said, but the tension was obvious. Then, to Jonathan's shock, Reynolds suddenly turned Michael around and pulled out handcuffs. Jonathan rushed outside. Whoa. What are you doing?" Reynolds barely glanced at him. "He's being arrested for disturbing the peace." Are you kidding me? Jonathan's voice rose. That's bullshit. I was right there. We were both talking. Michael remained silent, his hands now cuffed behind his back. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with frustration. Sir, step back, Reynolds warned Jonathan. Jonathan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew that if he pushed back too hard, things could get worse for Michael. He had seen situations like this before on the news, but never up close, never in his own town. As Michael was led to the patrol car, Jonathan turned to the cafe owner. Greg, tell them. You saw what happened. Greg shifted uncomfortably. I don't want to get involved, Jonathan. Jonathan stared at him in disbelief. Are you serious? You know this isn't right. Greg avoided his gaze. I just run a cafe, man. The realization hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. People were willing to turn a blind eye. They didn't want trouble. Maybe they didn't care. Michael was placed in the back of the squad car. Before the door closed, he locked eyes with Jonathan and said just 3 words. Now you see. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. He had always believed racism wasn't a problem in his town. He had convinced himself that things were better, that injustice was something that happened somewhere else. But now he wasn't so sure. And for the first time in his life, he realized that staying silent made him part of the problem. As the police car pulled away, Jonathan knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. Jonathan stood outside the cafe, staring down the street as the police car carrying Michael disappeared around the corner. A heavy weight settled in his chest. The injustice of what had just happened gnawed at him. He turned back to the cafe, where Greg had already retreated behind the counter, pretending to wipe down an already clean surface. The other patrons avoided his gaze, suddenly too interested in their drinks or phones. Jonathan walked back inside, his movements stiff with frustration. He approached Greg's counter and leaned in. You saw what happened, he said, keeping his voice even. Greg hesitated. Jonathan, I don't want to get mixed up in this. You know how things are. Jonathan's jaw clenched. How things are? He scoffed. You mean how things have always been? Greg sighed. Look, I didn't call the cops. Someone else did. The officer made his call. And you're okay with that? Jonathan demanded. You're just going to stand there and pretend you didn't see an innocent man get arrested? Greg exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. You need to let this go, John. Jonathan shook his head, laughing bitterly. That's the problem, isn't it? People just let things go until they happen again. And again. And again. He turned and walked out, his heart pounding with anger. He needed to do something. But what? Michael didn't deserve this. He had done nothing wrong. Jonathan pulled out his phone and dialed Michael's number, hoping he'd somehow still have access to it. No answer. Of course. Frustrated, he tried calling the local police station instead. Weston County Police Department. A female voice answered. Hi, I'm calling about an arrest that just happened at Greg's Cafe. A man named Michael Johnson was taken in. I want to know what he's being charged with. Sir, are you a relative of the individual? Jonathan gritted his teeth. No, but I was there. I saw what happened. Then you'll have to come down to the station if you want any information. The call cut off before he could say anything else. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, took a deep breath, and got in his car. If they thought he was just going to drop it, they were dead wrong. The Weston County Police Department was housed in a plain brick building, its front steps cracked from years of neglect. Jonathan pushed through the glass doors and approached the front desk. A receptionist with tired eyes barely looked up. Can I help you? Yes. I'm here about Michael Johnson. She glanced at a computer screen. He's being processed. No visitors allowed at this time. Jonathan clenched his fists. Processed for what? He didn't do anything wrong. That's up to the officers handling his case. Then let me talk to them. The receptionist sighed and picked up the phone, muttering something Jonathan couldn't hear. A moment later, Officer Reynolds stepped into the waiting area, his face blank. Sir, you need to leave. Jonathan took a step forward. Not until you explain why Michael was arrested. Reynolds folded his arms. He was causing a disturbance. We were arguing, Jonathan snapped. Why didn't you arrest me? Reynolds didn't even blink. I made a judgment call. Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You didn't arrest him for disturbing the peace. You arrested him because he's black. A flicker of something passed over Reynolds' face. Annoyance? Indifference. You need to leave before I charge you with obstruction, he said coolly. Jonathan stared at him, heart pounding. He wanted to argue, to shout, to demand justice, but he knew how this would end. Reynolds had the power here, and he wasn't going to budge. So Jonathan turned and walked out, his hands trembling with rage. But he wasn't giving up. A call for help. Sitting in his car, Jonathan took a moment to gather his thoughts. He needed to get Michael out, but how? Then it hit him. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Angela Carter. Angela was a lawyer, an old college friend who had moved back to town a few years ago. If anyone could help, it was her. He hit dial. John. Angela's voice was surprised. It's been a while. Yeah, I know, he said quickly. Listen, I need your help. There was a pause. What's going on? He explained everything, the argument, the arrest, the blatant unfairness of it all. Angela listened silently. When he finished, she exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ. I need to get him out, Jonathan said. Can you do anything? Angela didn't hesitate. I'm on my way to the station now. I'll call you once I know more. Jonathan felt a wave of relief. Thank you. I'll do what I can, she said. But Jonathan, if this is what it sounds like, it's bigger than just getting him out. He knew she was right, and for the first time, he realized that maybe this wasn't just about Michael. Maybe this was about all the times things like this had happened, and people like him had looked away. Not anymore. The fight for justice begins. By the time Angela arrived at the station, Jonathan was pacing outside. She stepped out of her car, all business, her dark suit and determined expression making it clear she meant to get answers. Inside, she demanded to speak to whoever was handling Michael's case. At first, they brushed her off, but when she introduced herself as Michael's legal representative, attitudes shifted. Jonathan waited anxiously outside, his hands shoved into his pockets. After nearly an hour, Angela reappeared, her expression tight. They're holding him overnight, she said. They're claiming he resisted arrest, which is total bullshit, but I'll file for an immediate hearing in the morning. Jonathan felt his blood boil. Resisted? He didn't do anything. Angela nodded. I know, but this isn't about what's fair. It's about what they can get away with. Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head. What can we do? Angela hesitated, then looked him in the eye. Make noise. Call people. Let them know what happened. The more pressure we put on them, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug. Jonathan had never been one to cause a scene, but looking at Angela and thinking about Michael sitting in a cell for nothing, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He pulled out his phone. It was time to fight back. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning. Michael was sitting in a jail cell for no reason other than being black. And the worst part, this wasn't new. It had happened before, to other people in other places, but now, it had happened right in front of Jonathan's eyes, and he wasn't going to let it slide. By morning, he had made a decision. He was done standing on the sidelines. As soon as the sun rose, Jonathan headed straight to the police station. He found Angela already there, pacing near the entrance. They moved fast, she said without preamble. The paperwork's already been processed. Michael is being officially charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Jonathan's stomach twisted. That's insane. He didn't resist anything. Angela nodded. I know, but they know how to play this game. They'll frame it as him being uncooperative, which, in their eyes, means he didn't immediately submit like he was supposed to. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, frustration bubbling over. So what do we do? Just let them railroad him? Angela's expression hardened. Not a chance. I've already filed for an emergency bail hearing. It should happen later today. If the judge is reasonable, Michael will be out by this evening. Jonathan exhaled in relief, but Angela held up a hand. That's just the first step, though. We need to prove this was an unlawful arrest. Jonathan frowned. How? Angela pulled out a notepad. We need witnesses. People who were at the cafe. Someone who can testify that Michael did nothing that warranted an arrest. Jonathan immediately thought of Greg. He saw everything, Jonathan said. He knows this was wrong. Angela nodded. Then let's go talk to him. Greg's cafe, the coward's dilemma. Greg wasn't happy to see them. When Jonathan and Angela walked in, he sighed and rubbed his temples, already knowing why they were there. Guys, come on, he said. I don't want to get involved in this mess. Jonathan's patience was running thin. Greg, you were involved. You were standing right there when it happened. Angela stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. We don't need you to take sides, Greg. We just need the truth. Greg sighed, looking anywhere but at them. I saw what happened, yeah. But what do you expect me to do? Testify against the police? Yes, Jonathan said flatly. Greg let out a humorless laugh. And then what? Get cops breathing down my neck? Maybe find a health inspector in here next week shutting me down for some safety violations? You think they won't retaliate? Jonathan clenched his fists. He hated that Greg was probably right. Angela's expression didn't change. You're scared, she said simply. I get it. But do you really want to be the guy who stood by and did nothing while an innocent man sat in jail? Greg shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flickered toward the counter, where one of his employees was pretending not to listen. Finally, he exhaled. I'll think about it, he muttered. Angela didn't push further. You have my number, she said, handing him her card. Let me know what you decide. As they left the cafe, Jonathan shook his head. We can't rely on him. Angela sighed. Maybe not, but I have another idea. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Angela pulled out her phone and scrolled for a moment before showing him a name. Officer Darrell Owens. Jonathan frowned. Who's that? A cop, Angela said. But not like Reynolds. Owens is black, and from what I've heard, he's one of the good ones. Jonathan was skeptical. So you think he'll help us? Angela shrugged. There's only one way to find out. Officer Darrell Owens met them at a small diner outside of town. He was in plain clothes, his police badge clipped to his belt. As soon as they sat down, he got straight to the point. I know why you're here, he said. Angela nodded. Then you know what happened to Michael was wrong. Owens let out a slow breath. Yeah, he admitted. I know. Jonathan leaned forward. So help us. Owens hesitated. You don't understand how deep this runs. Angela crossed her arms. Then explain it to us. Owens glanced around, then lowered his voice. Look, I want to help. But Reynolds isn't just some random officer. He's got backing. The department protects its own. Jonathan scoffed. Even when they're wrong. Owens' jaw tightened. Especially when they're wrong. Angela watched him carefully. But you don't agree with them. No, Owens said. I don't. There was a long pause. Then, finally, Owens sighed. I can't testify against my own department. But I can tell you where to look. Jonathan and Angela exchanged a glance. Owens continued. Check Reynolds' record. This isn't the first time he's pulled something like this. Angela's eyes lit up. You think there are complaints against him? Owens gave a small nod. More than a few. Most of them buried. But if you dig in the right places, you'll find what you're looking for. Jonathan felt his heart race. This was it. A crack in the system. Angela smiled. Thank you, Officer Owens. Owens exhaled. Just be careful. If you start kicking this hornet's nest, they will fight back. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Let them. Back in Angela's office, she immediately got to work. She pulled up police misconduct records, searching for anything related to Reynolds. It didn't take long. Got him, she muttered. Jonathan leaned over her shoulder, reading the screen. Reynolds had dozens of complaints against him. Racial profiling, excessive force, wrongful arrests. But somehow, none had ever resulted in disciplinary action. They've been covering for him, Jonathan said. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. Not anymore. She picked up her phone and dialed. Who are you calling? Jonathan asked. Angela's eyes gleamed with determination. The district attorney. Angela knew she had just crossed a line. Calling the district attorney meant this wasn't just a local matter anymore. It was about to get bigger, much bigger. She turned to Jonathan. If we go through with this, there's no turning back. You ready for that? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Michael's still in jail. Of course, I'm ready. Angela nodded and took a deep breath before speaking into the phone. This is Angela Carter. I have information on a police officer with a history of racial profiling and wrongful arrests. His name is Officer Daniel Reynolds, and I have records proving that complaints against him were deliberately buried. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, the DA's voice came through. Bring me everything you have. The bail hearing was set for that afternoon. Angela and Jonathan arrived at the courthouse early, but something felt off. 2 uniformed officers were standing outside the courtroom doors. Not the usual security. These were local cops. Angela whispered to Jonathan, "They're trying to intimidate us." Jonathan swallowed hard. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure, but he wasn't going to back down now. Inside the courtroom, Michael was brought in, still in his orange jumpsuit. He looked exhausted but determined. When he saw Jonathan, he gave a small nod of appreciation. The judge entered. The hearing began. Angela stood. "Your Honor, my client, Michael Carter, was unlawfully arrested after a verbal dispute with a white man. We have eyewitnesses and evidence that Officer Reynolds has a history of targeting black individuals without cause." The prosecutor smirked. "With all due respect, Counselor, your client did resist arrest. The officer was simply doing his job." Angela didn't flinch. "Then let's talk about Officer Reynolds' job." She stepped forward, holding up a thick file. "This is a compiled record of Officer Reynolds' misconduct complaints, racial profiling, excessive force, wrongful arrests. And yet, somehow, he has never been disciplined. Why? Because this department has been protecting him." Murmurs filled the courtroom. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Angela pressed on. "I have also submitted these documents to the district attorney's office for a formal investigation into this officer's history." Now, the prosecutor did flinch. The judge sighed. "Given the circumstances, I find no legitimate reason to deny bail." He banged his gavel. "Bail is set at $500. Mr. Carter is free to go." Jonathan exhaled, relief washing over him. Michael was coming home, but as they turned to leave, they saw him. Officer Reynolds, standing at the back of the courtroom. His jaw was clenched, his eyes burning with quiet fury. The system fights back. Michael was released that evening. Jonathan and Angela had just stepped out of the courthouse with him when a squad car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out. One of them spoke. "Michael Carter, you need to come with us." Angela stepped in front of him. "On what charges?" The officer sneered. "A pending investigation into possible assault charges from an earlier incident." Jonathan exploded. "This is retaliation. You're making this up because we exposed Reynolds." The officer just smiled. "If you've got a problem, take it up with the department." Angela was already dialing her phone. "Oh, I plan to." But before the officers could take Michael, another car pulled up, and out stepped District Attorney Evelyn Ramirez. She didn't waste time. "That won't be happening." The officers hesitated. Angela smiled. "I called in a favor." Ramirez walked right up to the officers. "This man was just released on bail. If you arrest him again without legitimate cause, you're going to have a much bigger problem on your hands." The officers looked at each other. Then, without another word, they got back in their car and drove away. Michael let out a breath. That was too close. Jonathan looked at him. "It's not over yet." The district attorney launched an official investigation into Officer Reynolds and the department's history of burying misconduct reports. It was the beginning of a storm. 2 weeks later, Angela got the call. "They're taking him in." Jonathan, Michael, and Angela stood outside the police station as Officer Reynolds was led out in handcuffs. He looked furious, his face red with rage. Jonathan met his eyes. This time, he was the one smirking. Reynolds spat. "You think this changes anything?" Michael stepped forward. "No, but it's a start." The reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing, questions flying. Angela turned to Michael and Jonathan. "We did it." Jonathan shook his head. "No, Michael did it. He stood up when the system tried to crush him." Michael smiled, the first real smile in weeks. Justice wasn't perfect. The system was still broken. But for the first time in a long time, they had fought back and won.